Networking Part 6. In this nugget, we're going to be talking about networking. This is Part 6. We'll start off by talking about wireless advantages. There's a lot of different reasons why you would want to use a wireless network, even in secure corporate networks. Right now, it's pretty well locked down so that it's pretty secure. I'm not going to say it's impossible to hack a wireless network, but by the same token, it's not impossible to hack a wired network either. So all things considered equal, it's really got some big advantages. There's also some disadvantages. And of course, one of those things I alluded to just a moment ago, and that has to relate to security. People are a little bit nervous about wireless networks. I mean, couldn't anybody just jump on there and get on our network? Potentially, yes, if you don't secure it properly. But there's several advantages you have to look for as well. There's also a whole study in infrastructure. You have to identify where to put your access points, whether or not they need to be plenum rated, whether or not you have channels that are overlapping, all different kinds of things to consider there that we'll look at. And then finally, we'll talk about security as well as demonstrating configuring your wireless access points. I recall a few years ago that I decided to take my wife and family to a timeshare up in Sedona, Arizona, which is very beautiful and peaceful. And I was sitting out on the balcony looking at the beautiful sunset, but I kind of started to get a little bit antsy. I can't sit still that long and just absorb peacefulness. I have to have a little chaos every now and then. So I connected my laptop to the hotel's wireless network, and it was a very weak signal. I was in the farthest corner of the hotel, and I wasn't very happy with the performance I was getting. So I looked around, and I found that there was another wireless access point that I could connect to with a strong signal, and it was unprotected. No encryption of any kind whatsoever. So I was able to browse the internet. I was also able to browse through their servers and their workstations and glean a great deal of information, by the way. And to make this even a little bit more disconcerting, this was a very well-known financial institution, and if I were to tell you the name of the company, you would know right away who it was. They're pretty big on Wall Street. By the way, don't blame me for the downfall of Wall Street in recent times. I'm not responsible for that, just because I was able to get into their network for a moment. Okay, actually it was more than a moment. It was like a couple of hours. But also, I decided to make things right, and I decided, well, I probably shouldn't just leave things open like that and leave them vulnerable. So I decided to go down there, and I talked to the manager of that particular location. And you would have thought I walked up to him and poked him in the eye. He was just very upset with me and combative. And then he stormed off and just walked off without even so much as a thank you for my warnings to him about his open wireless network. True indication that no good deed goes unpunished, huh? But that's all right. I would have done it again. It was still the right thing to do. But anyway, that is the big concern about wireless networks. I mean, there's a lot of advantages that we're going to take a look at shortly. But unless you can figure out a way to secure it, then the advantages really have very little meaning. Now, when it comes to wireless networking, one of the first things you want to understand about it is why you would want to use it in the first place. I mean, what are its advantages? Well, primarily, it's wireless. Okay, so obviously that's going to give us some big advantages. For example, in older buildings that already have, the walls up and maybe they're brick walls or they're cinder block or something like that, it may be very difficult to remodel in order to run wires. Similarly, in new home construction, I remember when we bought the home that we currently live in now, that was before wireless networking really became to make a big splash. Though security wasn't very good and it was only 802.11b at the time, and I really didn't want to have a wireless network in my home for security purposes, so while they were still in the framing stages, I used to sneak into the neighborhood at night, and I would take my big spool of Cat 5 cable, and I would run it along all of the wires up through all the rooms and everything like that, so I would have wired networking in each room. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and I was having to try to kind of duck the security guard, because this guy would come around in a white pickup truck and shine a big flashlight in all of the homes to make sure that there were no vandals or kids partying or something like that. So I had to constantly dodge that guy while I was running all this cable in my home. So in this case, I have wired cable throughout my house. However, because of the advantage of wireless networks, I really don't even use my wired network all that much. And then, of course, in existing homes, you just might not be practical to tear stuff out, rip walls out, and poke holes in drywall and all that to run wires. Might also be useful for things just such as a temporary network. For example, maybe you are moving an office space and you're in a temporary office space. Well, you don't want to have to poke holes in the walls there either, since it's not even your building perhaps. Maybe in a small work group kind of an environment, you can just put together a brief and quick wireless network. Same might be true for something like a trade show, where you don't really want to string wires in a convention center, although many of them already have some stuff there. But most conventions that I go to now, and most speaking engagements that I have, we usually have some kind of a wireless network that's available for our students to be able to log into. Okay. Also, there may be building codes that will prevent you from doing certain kinds of remodeling or to use a wired network in certain locations. So it may be also that wherever there's the only possibility that you can run cables in is along other kinds of wiring devices that might not be allowed by code. So you just cannot use wired environments. Same would be true, for example, in a historical district. Maybe you're in a place where it's an older building. You're not allowed to rip out walls and do anything to alter the main structure of the building. Well, hopefully, even if you did run wires, you wouldn't have to alter the main structure, but that can still get to be a very touchy thing, and you don't really want to get into trouble with that. Also, you get great mobility, for example, even in the office. I could take my laptop and I can work on it in my home office, and then I can go into my family room and watch The Office while I'm working on my laptop in there, still on the wireless network. Then I can take it upstairs and work in my loft area, and talk to my kids and stuff like that while I'm working up there. Same would be true in the corporation. You can go from one conference room to the next, one department to the next. In hospitals, they're very often using wireless networking now. I see where they will just transport a cart around, which has a printer on it and a small computer. They're not wireless, or excuse me, they're not notebook computers, but they're very, very small form factor, probably NLX kind of computers that they're using. My daughter broke her leg a couple of months ago. I took her to the ER, and they were running around with a little cart with a small NLX form factor computer in it. It was all wirelessly connected to the main network. Also, if you travel, of course, it has obviously advantages there as well. Most airports now have free Wi-Fi, or some might have it for a nominal fee. Many hotels now offer it also for free, or you may have to pay $9.95 a month. I usually just look for the ones that are free when I book my hotel, because I can't see spending $10 a night plus tax for several nights in a row for Wi-Fi. Also, wireless advantages avoid trip hazards. I mean, if you have a wired network, then that does sometimes prevent a trip hazard. Even if you're plugging into an established wall outlet, it depends on where the desk is and where the wire has had to be run. It's always a strategy that has to be looked at. In fact, when we first moved into this home, and I told you, I put a wired network throughout, and I didn't use wireless at first. One thing did convince me, however, to use a wireless network. You want to know what it was? Yeah, this guy right here. You see, this is a dog, a golden retriever, named a Tucson. Yeah, that's also a name of a city in Phoenix, I know. But Tucson is quite exuberant and playful and big dog. He is a big dog, even for a golden retriever, which are generally large dogs. He was huge. Anyway, he got all excited when I came home and I plugged my laptop into the wired network, and he ran through my office, got tangled up in that wired cable, and ripped my laptop right off my desk, and it came crashing to the ground. I'm sure gonna miss this dog on some days. No, I'm just kidding, folks. I wouldn't do anything bad to the dog. He's a wonderful dog, but friends of ours own him now. So there's definitely a trip hazard in that case, although it was a canine trip hazard. It was shortly after that I looked into upcoming wireless strategies that would allow us to secure our wireless network, and to install and use that primarily instead of a wired network. Obviously, there's going to be some disadvantages to wireless as well, and some of these disadvantages are a big part of the reason why wireless did not catch on real big right at the beginning. I think now it's certainly reached a big point, but in the beginning it did not, particularly. One of those things that you might run into as a disadvantage is that you sometimes get spotty service. I mean, if you're connected at the airport, you might be far away from the access point, over by, the far corner of the last terminal in the airport, and you might only get one bar. The same kind of thing happens to me when I go to hotels. For some reason, they always seem to stuff me in the far remote corner of the hotel, far away from the wireless access point. So I get very spotty, low speed service, or I just get disconnected sometimes. I don't know why they put me way over there in that corner. I think it's probably because I creep out the other hotel guests or something like that. But anyway, so they put me in a distant location sometimes. Actually, it's because I request it, because I don't like to be near the elevator or the vending machines or anything like that. But as a result, I also get weak signal or spotty service. You may also have trouble with freeloaders. Now, in my own neighborhood, I can see other wireless access points from my laptop. I could probably get free internet access, because some of those are unsecured. The thing is, it'd probably be less bandwidth than I get through my own wireless access point, and because I have a stronger signal in my own home. But otherwise, if I wanted to cheap out and save myself, I don't know what I'm paying. I think it's like $60 a month for up to 20 megabits per second over my broadband connection. Well, I could get free internet access from my neighbors instead if I really wanted to start, locking down the budget. I should stop talking about it. The more I think about it, the more attractive that option sounds. Anyway, you want to avoid that. First of all, it's just not fair for you to pay $50-$60 a month for your internet access and have other people in your neighborhood getting it for free. This would be particularly true in condos or densely populated areas such as apartment complexes, where it's very likely that you have multiple wireless access points in operation. Another thing to consider there is it may get you into legal trouble. If somebody's doing something illegal on your wireless network and authorities, law authorities, track that down, they could track that down to the wireless access point that you are using, because it's going to get an IP address from your ISP, and they may trace it to your access point. So even though you may be entirely innocent, someone else may have been using your access point illegally, and it could cause a big problem for you. So avoid that. Also, there's issues of radio frequency interference. There's a number of environments where this could take place. This could take place in industrial locations where heavy machinery will generate magnetic fields, not radio fields, but magnetic fields might affect certain networking equipment. But there may also be radio equipment in those warehouses and so forth as well that is used to communicate with robotic devices or other kinds of devices in the environment. Medical devices sometimes will have radio signals that are emitted as well. Video cameras. In fact, I just installed a set of video cameras for a client, and it also used a band of radio signals that was very close to the wireless access points they were using as well. So we had to really strategize that and place things very carefully. Also, microwave. Microwave ovens can also emit radio frequencies. Elevators may do this as well. Also, elevators might not just be the fact that they're emitting radio signals, but it can also be that they're very thick-walled. Those elevator shafts, for the safety of the elevator, have to be very secure in terms of the stability, and so it might have concrete walls all around it. Well, the wireless access point probably isn't going to penetrate that. Also, the cordless phones. When we first started using wireless networks in my own home, my wife started to complain, "Hey, my cordless phone, I keep getting my calls dropped." And she's an interior designer, so she's constantly talking to clients and stuff. And it seemed kind of rude because her clients were getting a little upset that she'd keep hanging up on her. Well, she'd have to call back and apologize. And she paces the room a lot when she talks, so every now and then as she's pacing the room, it would just get dropped again. And I kept saying, "Oh, that must be your imagination. Maybe the battery's dying or something like that." I kind of disregarded it. I know I'm a bad husband, right? I shouldn't have done that. But then one day, I was using the cordless phone, and as I was walking around the house, my call got dropped. And it was then that I realized we had a real serious problem, needed to be addressed immediately. It turns out that the access point we were using was in the 2.4 gigahertz range, and our cordless phone was also in the 2.4 gigahertz range. And so as we would walk closer to the access point, they would start to fight over the frequency, and we would just get our calls dropped. So obviously, that was a bad idea. What I did was I eventually changed phones to a 5.8 gigahertz frequency. Also, there's issues of security, and this is going to be the big thing here. Number one, wireless networks are an easy hacker target. I mean, you might have a corporation here, where you've got maybe multiple floors, and these are all the windows in the building and stuff. And out here in the parking lot, you've got some hacker sitting out here. Put some wheels on this thing. Anyway, a hacker sitting out there, maybe that's their Yugo or something like that. They're on their laptop, and you can get devices off the internet, things such as a CanTIA. It's like an antenna, only it's called a CanTIA. It's actually made of a Pringles can, or it resembles a Pringles can, and it gives you a stronger signal boost so that you can actually pull up wireless signals from greater distances. In fact, when I go sometimes to DEF CON in Vegas, that's a hackers conference, they have these wireless signals that they're able to retrieve from miles and miles away. And the last one I knew of was over 21 miles away. Now, of course, they had a receiver that was a big satellite dish, and it was on the back of a truck, and they actually had a trailer to haul it 21 miles out into the desert before they started to lose signal off of a conventional wireless access point that was at the convention center. But my point here is that anybody can connect into these wireless signals in many cases. So if they're not properly secured, this hacker could browse your network. It could see what's on your server. It could sniff the network and pick up other security secrets. It could pick off passwords off the wire. Very, very easy to do in an unsecured environment or one that's not properly secured. So unsecured access points are just wide open, and anybody can access them. Sometimes that's by design if it's in the airport or in the hotel, but other times it's really not designed to be that way, and you don't want anonymous people accessing the access point. But keep in mind that there are ways that you can secure wireless networks. So it's not as if you're stuck in a permanently insecure position. There are things that you can do to make it better, and we'll talk about that here as we go. Also, when you consider placing your wireless access points, you have to consider an infrastructure design for your environment. For example, the physical building, you're going to have to take a look at that, maybe look at blueprints, and identify some things that you'll have to consider. Where the elevator shafts are, where the wiring closets are. Because even wiring closets, if there's a lot of wires all together, then the wireless radio signal may have a difficult time penetrating that wiring closet. Same would be true of a large concentration of electrical wires or cables. So just keep those sorts of things in mind. Also, if you use multiple floors in your office building, well, those floors are usually separated by, concrete floors. And so if I've got an access point on floor number 1, it's not going to probably beam through the concrete to floor number 2, at least not get a good signal. So we're probably going to have a wireless access point at least per floor. Now, when you do that, another thing you can do is to use something called a loop antenna. That's not an A+ thing, but just FYI. You can use a loop antenna, which will tend to shape the radio signal in a flatter space. So it's not trying to go up above through the concrete floor, but it's distributing that more in a vertical space instead. And that way you're maximizing the available power of your radio signals. And there are other things that can do this kind of thing for you as well. You can use, range extenders so that you can kind of daisy chain. You can start in one portion of the building. Normally, you try to start centrally with wireless access points and work your way outwards, but it just kind of depends upon how much of the floor space your company leases and whether you're in an equally distant scenario where the wireless access point would equally reach all parts of your building. If it doesn't, you can use range extenders, which will take the existing wireless signal and boost it further on to extend it to a different length than it might otherwise be able to reach. Also, an important thing to identify is what channels that you want to use. The important thing about this is that if you have multiple wireless access points in the building, you must have good channel separation. You need at least 5 channels of separation between access points. Let's take a look at it this way. Here, if there's that's the ceiling, and this is the floor. Let's say I've got an access point up here in the plenum. I'll just put 2 antenna for access point 1, and I'll put 2 antenna here for access point 2, and then 2 antenna here for access point 3. Okay, so we want to kind of beam down as much of a wireless signal that we can get here, so our laptop users and whatnot can gain access down here. Now, the thing is, I have to decide what channels to use in this. So, for example, if I start with channel 1 on the first access point, then that's going to, have a little bit of a range, and it's going to have a little bit of spillover into the second access point here. I'm going to change colors to make that a little bit more clear. The second access point here is going to also overlap a little bit in the range of the first one. Now, what would happen here if I were to use channel 1 also on the second wireless access point? And by the way, all these access points will have the same SSID. Now, we'll talk more about SSIDs later on, the fact that you can hide them and so forth, but they do all have to have an SSID. So they'll have the same SSID, they'll have the same channel. Now what's going to happen? This poor laptop user that's here, I can't draw a laptop, I'll just draw a person. This person is going to have extremely freaky internet access or wireless access because they're going to be sometimes connected to this one, and then this one will just kick them off because it's going to be contending back and forth between these channel 1s here. And this causes a real problem. So what you have to do with this is you have to have at least 5 channels. Oops, wrong thing here. You have to have at least 5 channels of separation. What that means then is that I would need to put at least channel 6 right here. Okay. Now, in this case, it's going to this user will be able to associate with a specific access point. But if maybe they're roaming around the office or something like that, if they're kind of in so to speak no man's land here, they're not going to get this contention between these 2 access points. Whichever one they're on will currently be just fine. They'll just stay with that one until the other one is stronger, as maybe they shift over this direction a little bit. Then it'll flip them over to this one, in many cases seamlessly. Now there are some security issues there as well, because they may have to re-authenticate, but there's some other things that we can take a look at here in a little while relative to that. Now, as the user continues along the building, maybe they're going to another conference room. What have we got here? Well, we have access point 3. And guess what? It also, oops, I don't seem to be getting any color out of there. Let me try that again. Access point 3, it's also going to overlap a little bit right here. So do you think I'm going to put channel 6 right here? No, because then we're going to have the same problem again, where this user gets kind of stuck in no man's land, and they can't get signal from either one of them, really. They just keep getting bounced around between the 2 of these. So what we would do here is we would have to have at least 5 channels of separation. Now, if this access point has no contact with this access point, really, we could set it back to channel 1. Okay, so there's not going to be any contention there. Or if we want to just be double sure, we could set this up at channel 11 instead. And that way we'd have 5 channels of separation between all 3 of these, and we don't have any contention with the channel number. And by the way, what happens with the channel number is, let's say that we're in the let's just say that we're in the 2.4 gigahertz range. Okay, channel 1 is actually, I don't really remember the number, but that's actually channel, like 2.4. It's an incrementally higher. Channel 2, channel 6 here might be 2.4.5 or something like that. So really what happens is, as you change the channels, it increases or decreases the frequency just incrementally to keep you out of trouble from overlapping signals here. Now, you may also have some compatibility issues. Maybe someone bought some wireless access points 4 or 5 years ago, but now you need to get some more because, maybe you're expanding into a different part of the building. Well, how do you make sure that your old ones are compatible with the new ones? As something of a general rule, I've got a wireless networking document here for you, and if they follow the same frequency, radio frequency, then they're generally compatible. You can, again, download this as well from nuggetlab.com. It'll be part of that big zip file that you'll have available up there. But anyway, here we see the various generations of the network types. There's 802.11a, b, g, and n. A is not used very often or very much, but if you did have it, notice that it was on the 5 gigahertz frequency. Now, as a result of that, you could make that work with 802.11n, which is the more current version of wireless networking, and that would also have the ability to work at 5 gigahertz. Now, not all 802.11n access points work at 5. Most of them work at 2.4, but some of them allow you to switch back and forth between one or the other. Okay, so in this case, I could work older A with the newer N's. I could also work the older B's with the newer N's as well, because they're also on the same frequency. In fact, all 3 of these really pretty much would be able to work together. And then you see also some additional information I have here, the range, the expected range of these. Generally, you're going to get about 100 meters, although with things like range extenders and you have some other items there, multiple input, multiple output range items that may affect that as well. Multiple input, multiple output is MIMO or MIMO, some people say as well. And this is generally intended to increase the bandwidth that you can get, although it may extend the range a little bit as well. We generally think of it as a way of increasing bandwidth, though. Here's the available bandwidth for each one of these as well. 802.11a, you can only go 50 meters, and it gives you the same bandwidth that you can get for many of these other standards. So generally speaking, we're better off with going with G, which is not too old at the time of this recording, and N, if possible. And if you're buying new devices, then that's generally going to be the better way to go. Now then, finally, on the infrastructure design item, there's probably a lot of other things you could consider in your infrastructure. These are just some of the top items that I think that might be of interest. And then there's also a group policy object that you might be aware of. This is probably not going to be on the exam in my estimation, but it's still useful to know about for those of you that are in corporate environments, just to know that there's a wireless network policy that you can configure here by right-clicking here and choosing creating a create a new wireless network policy, and then you just name it whatever you want it to be, and then you'll add in the SSIDs, which are the service set identifiers. In other words, what the name of your access points are. The clients have to know the name in order to be able to properly connect to them. You could do ad hoc, which is really a direct computer-to-computer connection. Might be useful for just temporary, quick connections to other people's computers, but we don't really do that very often, and it's not considered secure. Infrastructure would be better, and then you would name the SSID, Corp SSID 1 or something like that, and you might have more than one. Corp SSID 2, something like that. These would be the actual names of my access points. Then I can connect automatically, or also connect to a more preferred network if available. This would happen if I were connected to number 2, but I was using my laptop and moving it closer to a conference room where SSID 1 was closer. Then I would get a stronger signal out of it. It can switch me over to that one. And then you can also connect even if the network is not broadcasting. The A+ exam would recommend that you disable SSID for security purposes, which I'll talk to you about later on. If you do disable that, then the client computer has no way of finding it. It basically makes that access point invisible. So then you would have to connect even if the network is not broadcasting. You'd have to choose that second option. And then there's some security options here as well. We have WPA or WPA2 for both enterprise and personal. The enterprise one uses a radius server. There's also 802.1x, which normally also uses a radius server. It is not strictly a wireless authentication mechanism. That can also be used on wired networks. And then you have encryption, so you want to encrypt the network traffic, and you can use the temporal key integrity protocol, which is very good, or the advanced encryption standard, which is stronger, and so you should probably go there if you can. Then you have a number of different ways of authenticating against the network. The primary one's probably going to be PEEP right here, but there's some other methods you can use as well if you want to. And then there's also smart card or other certificate, which you can also choose if you like. There's also down here user authentication mode. You can use user or computer authentication, computer or user authentication exclusively down here as well. Now what's that about and what's the difference there? Well, when you want to authenticate against an access point and prove that you have the rights to be there, so to speak, then you need to identify who you are or who your computer is. It can go either way, and depending upon which one you choose here, then you'll be able to get access to that wireless network. In this case, it would allow either one of those to connect. There's also a caching mechanism that can take place here, because you might connect to a specific access point, and then maybe you turn off the maybe you switch to another location in the building or something like that, and went to a different access point. Well, when you come back, it can use the cached information that you had from your previous connection, so that it doesn't have to go through the whole authentication process all over again. Might help you to make reconnections a little bit faster. Now let's talk about securing wireless networks. This is of critical importance for the A+ exam objective, so I'd be very well aware of what I'm about to show you here. One of the things is that when you first plug in your wireless access point, you want to be sure to change the administrator's username and password. Some access points only have a password. In other words, you could use any username, or you could leave it blank. It doesn't matter, as long as you know the password. Others, more corporate level ones, will probably have a username and a password that you'll have to change. You can possibly rename the administrator account, and there's also a default password that you'll also want to change. Now the reason for that is because hackers are well acquainted with the default username and password for most common, especially consumer level, wireless access points. So they could do what we call war driving, which is where they will just take their laptop and drive through your neighborhood and look for your access point. And then in order to administer it so they can modify it for their own purposes and open ports on your firewall and so forth, well, they'll just log in or attempt to log in with the default username or password, and if they're successful, then they own your access point and can do whatever they want to with it, including just vandalize it and make it useless. So be very well aware of the fact that you need to change the username and password so that the casual hacker will not be able to administer your access point. Now, by way of example here, I've just gone to a wireless access point that I had sitting around. I don't really use it anymore, but it's a pretty good access point. It's a 802.11n. It's a Linksys access point. I hit the button in the back, I turn on the power, and I pushed a button in the back for a few seconds, which resets all of its settings to default settings, so that I can kind of show you what it looks like a little bit more, out of the box. And then the only other changes I made to it were that I disabled DHCP on it because I don't actually want to use that on my network. And I also changed the IP address of it so that I can show it to you, because normally Linksys access points are 192.168.100.1. But I'm on a 10. network and I needed to connect to its web page to show you. So here I have I've got typed in the browser address bar 10.10.10.2, which is what I've made the IP address for this access point. And when I press enter, you'll see that it asks me for a username and a password. Now I said earlier that you can make the username whatever you want to. So I could make it, Captain Kirk or Crunch. Let's do it that way, Crunch. All right, boy, if I can spell. How about Captain Typo? How about that? And then the password, by default, on all Linksys access points is admin, A-D-M-I-N, for consumer-level access points. Now, the significance of this is that hackers everywhere know the default password for Linksys, D-Link, any other brand out there. There's kind of a list of default passwords that they know about. So if they're just driving through my neighborhood and I never change this password, they can change it to whatever they want it to be. And then I'll go ahead and log in, and you can see that even with my username of Captain Kirk /Crunch, I'm able to get into this network. Now there's a lot I want to show you here, and we'll come back to a lot of these things later on. But our current topic being the password change, let's go over here to administration. And each vendor has a different interface and different tabs and links and click things, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to teach you the interface because that doesn't really apply to everybody. However, what I want to point out is that here's where I could, in this interface, change the password. So I would change that password right here. Now, that would then satisfy the A+ exam objective about securing your wireless access point, at least one of the points of security. Now, let me give you a reality check on this as well. I could change this password to something extremely long and complex, but a knowledgeable hacker with a packet sniffer will still be able to figure the password out. Now, why is that? Because this password is sent in the clear over the airwaves. Okay, it's sent in the clear, meaning that there's no encryption of it. So anybody with a packet sniffer will be able to find my password anyway. That goes beyond the A+ scope, but I wanted you to know about that in real world and in real life. One thing you could do with that is you could change it to HTTPS here like this. See the interface change I made there? That means then that up here I would also type HTTPS in the address bar, and then it would encrypt the password, and then it would be much, much safer. But that requirement is not really an A+ exam objective. So returning to our whiteboard here, let's take a look at a couple of other measures that we could use to secure your wireless access point. Number one, disable the service set identifier. Number two, use MAC filtering. Notice they have asterisks right here. That's because it's kind of a note to self that I want to give you a reality check on these items as well. But for the time being, I'm going to give you the official A+ line of how you secure your wireless access points, okay? And then I'll come back to telling you why this doesn't actually work. Okay. So first of all, A+ would tell you that you want to disable the service set identifier. And if I go back over here to actually wireless, this is where the SSID is. Notice that it's just the default name of Linksys. Now, if you're using D-Link, they have a default name. Whatever vendor you use, they all have a default name that comes out of the factory like that. The reason why I would want to change that is because right now I'm advertising that it's a Linksys access point. Therefore, my little hacker friends will go down their list of access points. They'll say, oh, Linksys. The default password for that is, and then they would know the password, or at least if I had not changed it. In addition, there may be security weaknesses in this Linksys access point that have not yet been updated. Maybe there's a firmware update that needs to take place or something like that. Most users are ignorant of those types of firmware updates. In fact, I bet nobody in my neighborhood has ever updated their access point except for me. So it's very easy pickings if people just go through the neighborhood and they just look for the default SSID. Now, what does A+ say to do about that? They say, where it says enabled the broadcast here, they say to disable it. Okay, that way I could leave this at Linksys, or I could change it to whatever else I want it to be. But the hackers driving through my neighborhood won't even see my access point. It'll be invisible, and if you can't even see or touch it, then of course it's pretty much the same as not being able to hack it at all, right? Maybe not. There's an exception to that I'll tell you about here in a little while. But anyway, this is the A+ line that they want you to know about. you need to disable the SSID and also change the SSID as well. So I might just call this James, AP, access point. Another thing you could possibly consider is, if you didn't disable this, and if it was still visible for some reason, you might change it to another name, D-Link, something like that. And this would hopefully at least give the hackers the wrong information so that they think that they're hacking into a D-Link with its default password and any weaknesses that it might have, when in reality they're accessing a linksys access point. Now again, experienced hackers will be able to figure out before too long that you're trying to fool them, but it's kind of a speed bump at least. Okay? So in summary, the things to keep in mind here for A+, change the SSID and disable it. Okay? Those are the key things right there. Now, other things that A+ says to do is to use something called MAC filtering. What would that help? Well, let's say that you're in an apartment complex and you know that there's all kinds of other people trying to hop onto your access point and freeload off of you and get free internet access from your AP. What you could do about that, though, is you could go in here and choose this wireless MAC filter. And again, your vendor will have some similar wording to this. Then you would choose enabled. And then you would choose prevent PCs below from accessing the wireless network. So you could go blacklist or whitelist. This would be a blacklist. So anybody that's in the list down here of MAC addresses, I will not allow them to make a connection to my network. Now, as a way of quick review, how do you find out what your MAC address is? There's actually a couple of different ways to do this. You could use ipconfig /all, or you can also type get MAC. So if I type in get MAC right here, then that will show me that what my interfaces are, and it will show you my MAC address. And I think that this one is my MAC address for my current interface. Okay. So anyway, that's the MAC address. And if I realize that MAC address belonged to a hacker or something like that, then I might go through here and I would just type in E0CB CB 4E 2C 5B 1F, okay? And then that would then prevent them from being able to make a connection to my wireless access point because they'll be blocked right at the attempted access. Now, in reality, for most folks, they probably will choose permit instead. They'll use a whitelist instead of a blacklist. So then, the only people that can use my access point are the ones that I have a MAC address for right here. So if I get a new laptop and it's got a MAC address, of course, then I'll have to enter that in here. And by the way, when you click apply down here, or save settings, it actually puts in these colons for you. I typed them in, but it'll put those in for you in this particular vendor's product. But you'll just whitelist by entering in only the ones you actually explicitly want to access. And then if somebody is not on this list and they're trying to connect to your access point, that greasy guy up in 5C, he keeps trying to get free internet access from you. Well, not any longer because he's not in your whitelist. And that's one of the A+ recommended ways for securing your access point. Now, let me point something out about this item. Actually, both of these items, the SSID issue we talked about and MAC filtering. Both of these are such minimal levels of security that they're really not security at all, and it really almost gives you a false sense of security. So the A+ line is, this will secure your access point. The reality is it does very little, if anything, to secure your access point, and I'm just telling you that from an experienced wireless administrator's perspective. Now let's talk about why these are not really secure. Okay, this is not an A+ exam item, but in the real world, you're going to need to know this. Okay, here's my access point. Okay. And it's got a couple of antennas sticking out. And under normal circumstances, it's going to broadcast through a beacon the name of the access point. Let's say that's AP1. So we have SSID enabled here, and it's being broadcast through the beacons. If I disable SSID, the name of this access point is still AP1. My clients will still connect to an access point named AP1 if they've been properly configured. The only thing is, now it's invisible to hackers and casual passersby. The reality is, experienced hackers will still be able to sniff the radio signals that are being emitted from this access point, and there's certain other data that's included in those other signals that still names the access point. So they'll still be able to find the access point without a whole lot of effort. Another way that they could find the access point's name, by the way, the SSID of it, is let's say I've got a computer here and it's got a wireless network card here. Let's say that it already knows how to connect to AP1, even if it's hidden, even if it's disabled the SSID. Well, we're still connecting and just fine. Here's what happens though. When I turn on this computer, it has to find AP1. So what it's going to do is it's going to send out what we call a probe request. I'll just put P-R, probe request symbol or message saying that it's looking for AP1. Well, a hacker can intercept that message and again immediately identify that the name of my actual SSID is AP1. Let's also talk about this MAC filtering that we were using to supposedly secure our network. Okay, so here, it doesn't matter whether I'm blacklisting or whitelisting, but let's just say I'm whitelisting, and only this particular MAC address is allowed to connect. Now, how is that not really secure? The fact of the matter is, there's still other ways to sniff the air, so to speak, using certain tools, and identify the MAC addresses that are available out there. Because almost any network packet will have the actual MAC address in it. So a hacker will still be able to sniff for MAC addresses, and then they can change their MAC address to one of the MAC addresses that are on the whitelist. Or alternatively, change their own MAC address to a MAC address that is not on my blacklist if I'm using a blacklist. There's several tools that allow you to do this. I like to use Enable, which is a pretty good hacking tool. There's also SMAC, S-M-A-C, which allows you to change your MAC address on your computer so that you can pretend to be something else. And because of these kinds of tools, MAC filtering has very little effect at all in terms of real security. Alright, now what I've done here is I've just gone ahead and downloaded SMAC 2.0. Again, there's a lot of different tools that do this. But here's my real MAC address. I could just change that to this. And I could just do so, and then I would thereby prevent myself from being blacklisted anymore. Or I could enter in a MAC address that I know is actually on the whitelist, and then I could get onto that access point, or at least start to get on it. So this gives you an idea for the fact that you can use various utilities and things to fake your MAC address. I can also use security protocols for a good level of security. Now, this is really where your security is going to come in, really, pretty much at these levels down here at the bottom. So even if I enabled my SID, so other people could see my access point's SSID, I'm fine with that, as long as I'm securing it in other ways. And one of the first ways you could secure is the oldest way, and that would be to use wired equivalency protocol is what that's called. And that is supposed to encrypt your network traffic. The problem is there's a number of different hackers' utilities that make quick work of that encryption. One of the ones that comes to mind, one of the early ones that worked very well, was one called WebCrack. Okay? And all a hacker would have to do is to sniff your network for a little while and run this thing just for a few moments, and it would immediately, well, not immediately, but within short order, it would have your WEP key. Because what happens with this is you have to supply a unique key that's a secret key, and it's not going to be broadcast in any of these frames. But there's enough information in here that is reversible in terms of the encryption that WebCrack is able to decipher the actual password that you use, the actual key that you use to encrypt your access point. Now, these are much more secure. Wi-Fi Protected Access and Wi-Fi Protected Access 2, or WPA and WPA2. There's two editions of this. There's the Enterprise Edition, which requires other infrastructure that should exist in the network. And there's also a Personal Edition. The other infrastructure that is required for the Enterprise Edition, as well as 802.1x, is something called a Radius server. And what this does is it will take any attempts to authenticate against your access point, and it will forward those attempts onto some other computer. Actually, there's your Radius server. I'll put rad for radius. And then your Radius server forwards those credential requests onto some other computer. Normally that's going to be a domain controller, as in an Active Directory domain controller. So then if the domain controller says, yep, that computer is a valid computer, or that user is a valid user using one of these methods, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. Then the domain controller will pass that back to the Radius server. The Radius server will allow that communication to take place then through the access point, or at least authenticate that person or that computer, and then they're on the network. Now that sounds like a roundabout way to do the authentication, but it's actually pretty quick. You don't usually notice that in terms of the user experience. Now here I've returned to the Linksys interface for my particular access point, and I'm going to go down here and talk to you about DHCP server settings. For A+ exam objectives, it's just important to know that this this device, and it doesn't have to be an access point. A lot of times they're wireless routers or internet routers that you can get on a consumer level. These days, most homes are buying wireless access points that include both switched ports and firewalls. So it's kind of all one thing right now. But regardless of whatever you want to call it, whatever format you've purchased, many of them will have a DHCP server. This allows my users just to come onto the network without having to have IP knowledge. It'll automatically configure everything for them. So in this particular case, I had disabled it, but here I've enabled it. And then the starting IP address would be whatever I want it to be. So I can exclude any addresses I don't want to be leased out, and I can specify a maximum number of users. Now this might be useful in kind of a rudimentary way to somewhat throttle your wireless access point traffic, because it can only bear so much traffic in and out. And if I wanted to throttle that down, I could reduce this number so that only a certain number of clients would actually be able to get onto this access point. Other things I would have to know, though, would be the IP addresses for my DNS servers. Now, I would just get this from my DNS server, which is Cox in my case. I don't know what it is. Let's say it's 68.56.1.2 or something like that. And then my clients would have this DNS address in their IP configuration, and then they would query against this specific DNS server anytime they needed to resolve internet names. You can see that you have to change the time as well, for example. Actually, you don't have to, but most people actually will. So this is one of those things you'll have to know about, that you can use DHCP. One thing you want to avoid is if you have two access points on the network, make sure that you do not assign overlapping IP addresses. So if I've got another access point on the network, maybe I would assign it starting at 150 or something like that, or 151. So this one would go 100 through 150. And the other access point would be 151 up through whatever the end of the range is. Okay, so that would be one way to do that. You just want to make sure that you don't have any overlapping values between your access points. Because if you do, it's possible that these access points will issue duplicate IP addresses to 2 or more hosts on the network, and then you would have a network communication problem and some complications. Now, in case you could get confused about this, if you look at the top of the interface, you'll notice that it also said Automatic Configuration DHCP. Well, wait a minute. I thought that's what we were configuring down here. How come that's in 2 different interfaces? The reason why is because this top setting here refers to how my access point gets its IP address. Remember, I have to have a public IP address to communicate on the internet. And this access point needs to get that from my ISP. My ISP has a DHCP server, so it doled out an IP address to this particular access point. And if I didn't use DHCP, there would be other methods that I could use, such as a VPN, PPTP, and L2TP are VPN methods. I could also use something like a static IP, where if you can see that I do that, then I'll just enter in my own IP address. Don't usually need to do that. Normally, you're going to be using an ISP's DHCP server. The exception to that would be if you want a static address so that you always know exactly what the address is supposed to be, then that's when you might choose the static IP option right here. And that would be useful if you want to always be able to remote troubleshoot the router or something like that from across the internet or something. That way you're not concerned that it might expire its lease at some time and change its IP address. Although another way around that is to be able to resolve the name of this router by name instead. In order to do that, you'd have to use something like dynamic DNS. I'm not really going to explore this right now. I just want you to know that it's available. But what I could do is I could use one of these services, for example, like dyndns.org. And then you would have to create an account with them, going to their web page. Once you've done that, you can then fill out the rest of this information. And what would happen then is it would periodically reach out to the dyndns.org servers and identify the public IP address that you have. Then it would register it with the dynamic DNS servers, and I could resolve that unknown name from across the internet at any time, even if the IP address changes from my ISP. And then I was mentioning earlier that you needed to make sure that you assigned channels that were not overlapping if you have more than one access point. Here, what I've done is you can choose in this particular case, a B and G mixed, because you can't have both B and G together on the same network. So, for example, remember I was saying earlier that you might have an older access point as well as a newer access point. Well, B and G access points are compatible, and if I wanted to integrate this access point into an existing BG infrastructure, then I might choose that option right there. Otherwise, I might choose G only, B only, N only, whatever. Okay. If I choose mixed, then we can use any of those various standards in our wireless network. Then we can choose a radio band, and this would be important if you wanted to go, for example, with a wireless N only. Going to a wider band will give you more flexibility and better connectivity, but you don't have to do that. And then you can also specify the standard channel. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. If we have a standard channel of 1, then it only gives me these two options if I'm going to use the wide channel. If I want to go back to auto, though, for example, or rather to standard channels, then I can go down here and specify additional channels like 1 and 6 and 11, because that would give me 5 channels of separation. So if I choose a wideband channels, then I only get 2 selections. If I choose standard 20 megahertz channels, then I can choose anything in between here, between 1 and 11. Now, also notice again that, as I mentioned earlier, that when you choose a channel, it actually changes the gigahertz incrementally here. And you can see that these numbers are all slightly different. They're all 2.4, but they're not exactly 2.4. Okay, so that's just something else to look at there. And then this again is where you would enable or disable your SSID. I say just leave it enabled because that makes it easier to configure your clients. And if you perform good security measures in other places, then you don't have to be concerned about having a publicly visible SSID. And then here you can see I've gone over to the wireless security section. The security mode right now is disabled, meaning that any passerby can view my SSID and make a connection with it using their wireless network interface card. Here I would change, however, to something like WPA, let's say WPA Enterprise. Now notice that this page now changes its format. So if I'm going to choose WPA Enterprise, I have to specify the IP address for my Radius server, because remember, that Radius server is what's going to forward the request onto usually a domain controller to confirm that I'm a legit user or a legit computer. All right. So with Enterprise, you have to have servers in place that allow you to do that. All right. In my particular case, I could choose WPA Enterprise, WPA2. I went to the wrong place there. Excuse me. WPA2 Enterprise. Both of those are pretty much the same, and then I still have to specify a Radius server. It's just that with WPA2, which is more secure, I can also use TKIP or AES encryption, as I mentioned earlier, and it's not letting me do anything right now because I haven't entered anything in for my Radius server. But AES is more secure, whereas TKIP might be more broadly compatible if you have some other older equipment that doesn't understand TKIP. And then for either one, WPA or WPA2, you have to enter in a shared key down here. And you can type in something like this if you want to. I like to dance in the rain. Well, that sounds romantic, doesn't it? I like to dance in the rain and listen to Carpenter's music and drink Chablis. Oh boy, I just got in touch with my feminine side. Anyway, so you could type in a key down here. Normally, it's actually going to be more complicated than that. It's going to have special characters and the like, and then that will be used to secure the connection throughout this whole authentication process. And by way of example here as well, if you want to find a good password, I don't really know a lot about these folks, but I've used their password generator before. For all I know, they're actually collecting my passwords. But anyway, what you do is you enter in the password length that you want, and then you specify what kind of letters, mixed upper, lowercase, punctuation, all that kind of stuff. You tell it how many passwords you want, and then you choose Generate Password. And this is kind of useful because it's difficult for me to, off the top of my head, come up with a good, secure, complex password. Well, they did it for me right here. Okay, so that was pretty easy. And then it shows you the military phonetic way over here. Sierra, Echo, Zulu, question, kid, uniform. So anyway, kind of makes you feel like an Army Ranger or something like that. So anyway, I'll select all of this out here. And then if I really wanted to secure my wireless access point, other than just kind of entering in silly phrases, then I would do something like that here instead. And then now I'd have a real secure shared key. By the way, this is a shared key. What does that mean? This means then that on my client side, when I try to make a connection to this access point, I have to know that shared key. So if I'm an administrator, I might have a thumb drive or something like that that I protect very well with physical security, and it never leaves my keychain or anything like that. And I could copy this shared key onto that. That way, when I set up my client computers, I can just copy and paste it to their configuration. I don't have to memorize all 64 of these crazy characters. Now here I've gone over to the applications and gaming item where it says single port forwarding. What this really is it's useful for a firewall. Really what I'm adjusting here are firewall settings. So for example, let's say that we had a FTP site that we wanted people to download our product brochures from. Well, then I would just say FTP. You can call this whatever you want to, but for simplicity's sake, I'll call it FTP. And we want to open up port 20 and 20 on both, on TCP, I think is what that was, if I remember right. And then let's say that goes to 10.10.10.9, and I'll enable that rule. And then FTP is again here as well. Remember, we have to have port 21 as well. One's for control, one's for data, and TCP. So again, that would be on 9, and I would enable that one as well. And then when I was done with all of this, I would choose Save Settings. Similar thing I could do if I wanted to enable remote desktop. So then I would enter in port 3389. Okay, so that's how I would modify the firewall for port forwarding, for single port forwarding here. You can also do port range forwarding. There are certain applications, for example, or certain network services that use a range of addresses, such as certain types of multicasting or something. But let's just say, anything from, I'll just say my app, whatever that happens to be. And maybe it starts at port 6000, but it could randomly use anywhere between 6,000 and 6,200. Okay, and it only uses, let's say TCP. And then it would go to port, a TCP IP address number 30 like this, and enable that. So then for a specific application, it might need anywhere between 6,000 and 6,200 over TCP IP to that IP address. That's a port range forwarding. And then there's also port range triggering. I don't know if this is going to be on the A+ exam, really. But let's just call this, my app 2. And then I could say a range from 7,000 to 7,200. And then that would be the triggered range. Anytime something comes in on one of these ports, then we're going to forward it to a different range of ports. Some of them maybe go to port 8,000 to 8,200. Okay, so it might come in on port 7,000 when it's inbound, but it would forward it to port 8,000 on a destination, and then I would enable that. And this, again, is just going to be useful for certain kinds of applications that expect to see certain ports open. Really, we're just manipulating the firewall here and opening holes in it so that we can allow services and applications to communicate. All right, now here it's going to be important just to show an actual wireless connection. Right now, I've got a laptop that I'm connected to only over a wired connection here. I'm just using a wired connection. You notice that there's no symbol of wireless here. Usually there's like looks like bars that you would get on your cell phone for signal strength. So in order to make a connection to a wireless connection, then what I'm going to do here is click down here, and it'll immediately show up any available wireless networks. Now remember I was saying earlier that you can freeload in your neighborhood probably? Well, I could freeload off of this guy, whoever that is, because it's an unsecured access point. I could freeload off of this guy. That's a stronger signal. I'd probably use that one, because that again is an unsecured access point. I could get free internet access. Hey, the more I talk about it, the more attractive it sounds. Maybe I should just do that. Anyway, but here is the Linksys that I have been working with earlier. And I've just kind of reset that again back to default settings. But if I wanted to make a connection to it, notice that there's the exclamation point again, indicating that this is unsecured connection. So I can select it, and then I can also choose connect automatically. That means that from this point forward, anytime that network is in range and it's the strongest access point that I normally connect to, it'll automatically connect me to it without me having to go through this process again. So I'm just going to click connect to it just real quick here. Now what I want to do is to go to the wireless settings here to configure them so that I can make a secured connection to this network. Now notice that it gives me, in that previous page here, let me go back to that, it shows a little symbol, and then if you have this symbol on your client device. You can click it, and then it'll automatically configure you. Different vendors have different ways of having a real easy wireless setup. I'm just choosing the manual method, number one, because it's going to be pretty close to the same across all vendors, and number two, because the automated method is unique to this particular vendor. Other vendors would do it a different way. So here I'm just going to say, let's say I want to connect to an N network only, and I'm just going to leave the default SSID for now. I'm only just trying to show the security in this. That's all we're working on. Then what we would do is we would specify the wireless security here. So I'm going to go over here. And we'll specify that we want to use WPA2 Personal. This is the strongest level that you can get in something like a home network or a small office network in the absence of a radius server. So I've gone ahead and chosen the Advanced Encryption Standard as opposed to TKIP or AES. And I'm going to paste in a long password now. Now this is the 64-character password that the secure password generator gave to us. But I'm actually going to backspace that one because even though it's actually a 64-character password that is used, there's a little bit of padding with it, so you can actually enter in only 63 actual characters. Okay, so just bear that in mind. So I'm going to save the settings here. You can only use 63 characters. Now I'm going to click on Continue, and now we will have this connection required with this type of a passphrase. So that having been done, now I'm going to go back into this, and I'm going to go back to this linksys connection, and I'm going to connect. Notice that this time it's going to prompt me for that same passphrase. So you see on the client side, I have to have that same exact passphrase available. And you may have seen it fail the attempt just a moment ago, but I just quickly reconnected here. If it was initially connected and it connected just fine, and then I changed the security, sometimes you have to run at it a couple of times. Now it's prompting me for that network key, so I'm going to type that in. You can also hide the characters if you want to do so. But I'll just click OK now. Now we'll see that it's going to successfully connect to this linksys access point. And so now you can see we are indeed connected here, and it does use Wi-Fi protected access with a pre-shared key, and we're good to go. And any traffic that is sent over this wireless access point will now also be encrypted. Oh, you know what? Something else I should show you is that sometimes you need to update the firmware. I alluded to that earlier, but if you go over to Administration, and then you go to firmware upgrade. Again, with your access point, the interface will probably be a little bit different. But what you'll do is you'll go to, in this case, Linksys website, download the update for this particular model of access point. Then once you've downloaded it, you'll choose the file, you'll browse for that particular file, and then having done that, then you'll just go ahead and start the upgrade. You do not want to interrupt that, or otherwise you could ruin that access point, or you would have to completely reset it, but it could be a big problem. So just perform the firmware update. Sometimes that will apply additional security capabilities. Sometimes it'll do bug fixes. So sometimes it's very worthwhile to check into those firmware updates, especially if you're having some kind of troubleshooting problems. All right, now I know I've kept you a little bit long for this particular nugget, so I want to try to wrap this up as quick as I can with troubleshooting wireless networks. Now, a lot of the other things we've talked about for troubleshooting purposes, things such as devices or operating system problems, remember I've said many times in the past that a lot of the troubleshooting there is really just making sure that it was configured properly in the first place. So there's not really a lot of need to go into some of those troubleshooting items. However, with wireless networks, there's definitely enough there where things could go wrong and it could really frustrate you with properly configuring wireless. So let's just go ahead and address some of these. And a lot of these problems that you're going to see here will occur during setup. Once you get your wireless network set up, they usually pretty well just run. They don't really require a lot of maintenance thereafter. And there's not a lot of things that could suddenly, something kind of buggy come up and just kill it. So in terms of troubleshooting wireless, one of the first things you want to double check on again is the range of your wireless access points. Remember, if you have a group of users that keep saying that we've got a really weak signal, our internet access maybe or whatever is really slow, we try to transfer files, it takes all afternoon, well, you might need to put a range extender in there, or you might need to get a specialized antenna which kind of squishes the shape of the radio signals so that they are more directional towards those users. Or you might just need to get another access point. So range is a big issue there in terms of making sure that everybody gets the access that they need. Also, make sure that you have the proper key. You do want a secure key, and the key that you saw me enter in a little while back here when we were working with CompTIA A, that key is also used in combination with some other cryptographic methods to encrypt the network traffic, as I said before. Well, you may want to make sure that that key is not easily decipherable. That's why I usually go to the maximum, and that's why it's technically 64 characters for Wi-Fi protected access 2, although you can only actually type in 63. So make sure you get the proper key. It could also be that on the client side when you're trying to configure this, that you might have typed in a key wrong, or also if you've copied and pasted from the clipboard, very often when you copy the original key, if there's a space after the key, that gets copied too, and that counts as a character. So make sure that you're not copying any extra space after the final character. That sometimes will throw you off. Also, the key might change. There might be some kind of compromise, or you might be concerned about security in your wireless network. So a key change may have occurred. If that's the case, you may have to go back to your clients and change that key on those clients. Also, make sure that you have your channel overlap properly strategized. We talked about that before, where we had 3 wireless access points. Remember that if you have 2 adjacent wireless access points and their radio signals could scatter over top of each other, well, then you need at least 5 channels of separation. So very often we put things on channel 1, channel 6, and channel 11. And that's usually a pretty good scatter in terms of the range of channels. Also look for radio frequency interference. Everything might look right. All of the other stuff up here is fine. And yet, sometimes people just cannot seem to get connected to that network. There could, again, be machinery in the way, other things that create radio frequencies, cordless phones, and the like. Also, just look for a failing access point. This is a little bit difficult to identify at all times. In fact, this recently happened to me, probably at the end of last year. One of our access points seemed to be working fine, but periodically we would be completely cut off from the server and no internet access. Difficult to explain. Everything was configured properly. We hadn't changed anything on the server, and it was intermittent. You would never know when it would happen. It would just pop up, and all of a sudden we were kicked off. Well, I just replaced the access point. Never had the problem again since. So that's one of the things that you often do with troubleshooting, is you replace a suspect part with a known good one to see if the problem goes away. And if it does, then your problem was with that part in the first place. And that's not all I did. I also would unplug that wireless access point and plug it back in. In other words, I would reset it. And if I ever did that, then it seemed to resolve the problem. So that also was another clue to me that it seemed to be focused on that particular access point. Also, I don't think I really showed you this per se, but most access points will make this easy to replace because they usually have their own backup utility. I'll put BU for backup. And then once you replace the access point with a new one, you can take that backup and you can apply it to this new access point, and it's pretty transparent. You usually don't have to do much more than that, and it should be pretty much kind of a plug-and-play idea after that point, and it should just work just fine. In this nugget, we discussed networking. This was part 6, where we started off by talking about the wireless advantages. And of course, there's many advantages to wireless networks, not the least of which is that they're actually performing pretty well these days, especially with the N standard. As long as you're getting a good, strong signal, and you're not getting bounced off the network because of interference from other radio frequencies, it's actually pretty good. But there are significant disadvantages as well, particularly in relation to security. Because if you don't properly secure it, then the advantages are really of no use to you whatsoever if someone's compromised your data, stolen your personal information, and so forth. We also took a look in this nugget about the infrastructure of networking for wireless access. Now, there's a lot of different considerations, and it was too comprehensive to list all of them, but I did want to show you the main points to look at. Things such as making sure you have the right scatter across your channels. 1, 6, and 11, for example, at least as long as you have 5 channels of separation, and directional antennas, things of this nature. And then we talked about security and how to properly configure your access point so that you can make sure that your data is encrypted and as safe as can be reasonably expected. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.